What's going on, guys? So this is the first YouTube video I've made in probably 4 years, so I'm going to be extremely awkward and probably stutter a lot, and I'm not good at editing, and I'm filming on an iPhone, so this is a really shitty video, but I wanted to go over some key features that you guys might need to know if you're going to do a transmission swap. There's a lot of really advanced lessons, but we're going to stick to the basics today just so you guys understand, like, if you're going to do a manual swap, this is how it goes. A lot of YouTube videos or car shows, basically the people order the transmission and they're like, oh, you know, here it is, all this and all that, and then boop, it's in the car. And like, they don't explain how it got in the car, what they did, and there's very important steps and processes to making sure that this actually works out. So right here we have a 2007 Mustang with a Chevrolet 350 in it. Used to have a Muncie 4-speed bolted up to it because that's the easiest transmission to bolt to a Chevrolet 350. It was cheap, reliable, it was a wide ratio, so it beat the hell out of my clutch. And basically I'm just done with that. So we've upgraded to the Tremec Magnum. Now, some of the things that you want to know before you do a transmission swap, and probably the most important thing you need to know, is where will the shifter sit so the block, your motor block, obviously mounts to the bell housing. The first thing you want to determine is how far from the block is the shifter, because you want your shifter to always line up at the hole through the tranny hall. You don't ever want to order a Muncie or something ridiculous where you have to fab some crazy shifter like I did and drive like basically a semi truck, because that's how my shifter had to work to get to where it had to be, and it was really inefficient. You're going to make sure that your shifter location lines up with where you need it to be. That is one of the most important things straight off the bat. The second most important thing is your splines. So when you're ordering a new transmission, especially a manual, when you order a manual transmission, you want to know the number of splines on your inlet shaft, and you want to know the number of splines on your outlet shaft. Now, the inlet shaft splines are important because it'll tell you what kind of clutch you need to run, and your output splines are important because they tell you what kind of yoke you need on your drive shaft. Those are very important because whenever I was learning to build transmissions, I didn't know a whole lot about this shit. And my very first transmission swap into this car cost me like thousands more than it should have, because I was rushing it and I thought things would just bolt together, and they don't. So you definitely want to make sure that your clutch, you're buying the right clutch and you're buying the correct drive shaft to run this kind of transmission. The next thing that's very important is your pilot bearing. Pilot bearings come in all kinds of crazy sizes, so you want to make sure that you have a pilot bearing that'll accept the inlet shaft into the crankshaft of the motor. If the pilot bearing is not the same size, do not bolt the transmission to it. Wait, pull the old bearing out, and put the correct one in. Like, don't even fuck that up. So that's another important thing, is the size of the pilot bearing. The pilot bearing will ride right on here. The next thing you want to know for sure is your bell housing. You want to make sure before you order a transmission that they have a compatible bell housing from the block to the transmission. Now, QuickTime, also not sponsored or nothing, because I have like no fame whatsoever, but QuickTime makes a bell housing right here to go from a Gen 1 350 to the Tremec T56. Thank God they do, because I would have been screwed. The bell housing, you want to make sure it is compatible, and you want to know the size of it and what size flywheel and clutch you can run, and that'll let you know where your starter should sit. Those are all key factors right here. Very important. One of the next things you should know is the size of your tranny hall. You want to make sure that the actual transmission itself does fit in the car, because if it doesn't fit in the car, well, you're gonna have to cut that entire tranny hull out and have a fabricator or refab a new tranny hull to fit your transmission, and no one wants to go through that shit. So that's a very important thing to remember when you're doing a manual swap, is to make sure that the transmission actually does fit in the car. Thankfully, most manual transmissions, I can't say this positively, but most manual transmissions are smaller than automatics when it comes to rear wheels. So you should have enough room to fit the manuals. As in this case, this manual is probably around the same size as the automatic. Definitely not as long, but decently around the same size in all of this section right here. So it should fit. Another thing to pay attention to is your mount. You're going to want to have a very universal mount that you can move back and forth underneath the car, because the mount won't always perfectly line up. Depending on where your block sits, how far it sits in, you want to make sure that you have a mount that you can move and adjust to accommodate where the transmission will sit, up and down, bring your shifter up and down. You don't want to stress your motor mounts, but it's very important to remember that. So, I guess I'm going to throw this transmission in once all my parts come in, and I'm going to keep you guys updated on all of that. When it comes to the more complicated stuff, like aligning a bell housing or balancing the motor with the flywheel, we're not going to get into like all that technical stuff, but I will try to film the entire process of this tranny swap, so you guys have like a pretty decent idea of what's going on. And when I think of something that is of importance to basics, I will try to keep you guys updated, so you're not in the dark on what's going on here, because there's not a lot of information out there. There's a lot of guys who buy transmissions and then poop, they're in the car and they don't explain a whole process of how it's done. So yeah, basically that's where we're at today. We're waiting on a couple more parts, like the bearing retainer and the pilot bearing and the mount and a drive shaft. But once those are all in, I'm going to try to film everything, keep you guys informed on what's going on. And it should be a decent tranny swap, and I'll try to include as much information as I can for you guys. Anyways, for now, we got to wait for parts. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. Those are just a couple things you want to make sure that you have in your mind whenever you're shopping for a transmission. And I appreciate you guys watching. Thank you.